welcome to today's webinar called Beyond Prior Authorization, Ensuring Accuracy of Specialty Drug Claims. I'm Warren Lesniewski, Product Marketing Director here at Cotiviti, and I'll be your host today. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We have a couple of really knowledgeable presenters who will be providing a lot of good content in this short 45 minutes that we have today. Let me introduce our speakers. Jonathan Starr supports Cotiviti's vast library of drugs and biological payment policies and aids in presenting these policies to clients. He also managed and operated Cotiviti's pharmacy fraud, waste and abuse solutions since 2016. Jonathan is a PharmD as well. Matthew Herbine, he is our seasoned auditor, specializing in data science, analytics, and payment integrity, with a demonstrated history of working in information technology and healthcare services. He's responsible for overseeing pharmaceutical audit activities to maximize valid claim identification and overpayment recoveries while meeting contractual commitments and delivering customer satisfaction. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Warren. As Warren mentioned, my name is Jonathan Starr. I'm a pharmacist working here at Cotiviti on our drugs and biologicals team within our prepaid product. It's a privilege to be with you all today. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to be with us. Matt, would you like to say a few words before I dig into the content?
Thanks, Jonathan. As Warren mentioned, my name is Matt Herbine. I'm the Director of Audit Operations over the post-pay pharmacy audit here at Cotiviti. It's a pleasure being here with everyone today, and I look forward to providing a brief overview of different payment integrity approaches related to specialty drugs. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Matt. So first, I'd like to go over a few objectives that we hope to cover today. We'd like to briefly go over the specialty drug spend and how it's affecting healthcare in general, as also taking a broad look at prior authorizations and how prior authorization programs play a key role in help controlling that spend, but how there are also other approaches that need to be taken. So we will dig into some other payment integrity approaches as well as providing some examples. And then we will kind of go over some ideal scenarios on how to perform these payment integrity approaches. So once again, here's an agenda showing how we will start looking at current trends, dig into prior authorizations a little bit, and then focus the majority of our time on other approaches to payment integrity as they relate to specialty drugs. So looking at some drug spending trends, as these numbers relate specifically to J-code drug spend on medical claims for Cotiviti's prepay clients. So as you can see on the left side, there has been consistent growth year over year. I'd like to especially point out that in 2020, there was a 15% increase in drug spend compared to total medical spend over on the right, which took a significant hit to 70% decrease during 2020 as the pandemic first started. So the point here is that drug spend definitely continues to go up and contributes a significant portion to overall healthcare spend. As you see in the purple box in the middle, 75% of the $22 billion in spend on this graph is attributable to injectable drugs, with the top 5 of those drugs being listed in there as well.
Hi, Jonathan. Just to point out too, Jonathan did mention this is related to prepay, but just wanted to point out we are seeing very similar trends on the post-pay clients here at Cotiviti as well.
Thank you, Matt. As it relates to specialty drug spend, it's important to recognize that it kind of has a complex footprint. As you see on the left side, the pie chart refers to total healthcare spend across the U.S., with 13% of that being retail drug spending. Depending on the source you look at, about 40, 50, even a little over 50% sometimes of that retail drug spending is from specialty drugs. Then specialty drugs are also included in professional services as they're administered at clinics and hospitals. So about 45% of specialty drug spend also comes from the medical benefit. So as we go throughout today's discussion, please keep in mind that while we may be giving examples specific to medical claims or specific to pharmacy claims, specialty drug spend really comes from both sides. And it's important as we discuss payment integrity approaches to consider it from both angles. Now, what role do prior authorizations play as it relates to controlling drug spend? Well, prior authorizations in general could be summed up as having two main purposes. The first one we'd like to mention here today is reducing cost. They aim to select drugs that will have the highest efficacy, but also be as cost efficient as possible. It can also limit quantities necessary for particular drugs that only require therapy for a certain amount of time. They do also aim to achieve an improvement in patient outcomes. Many medications that are placed on prior authorization have particular safety concerns or adverse effects that are important to keep track of, and thus go through a prior authorization process before they are paid for and administered. Any medication that's subject to prior authorization is usually put up against a number of criteria, a sample of which are included here on the right. The most obvious one would be the diagnosis of the patient. As it relates to their particular health condition, it's important that it matches up with the medication and the indications that medication is approved for. They also look at patient-specific criteria such as their age, weight, body surface area. They'll look into the patient's current and prior therapies that have either been failed or may be necessary to be taken along with the medication being reviewed. Often lab work or procedures are also required ahead of or as part of that prior authorization review. And finally, all of that can go into calculating the appropriate dose for the patient. So prior authorizations serve a very important role in patient safety, patient outcomes, but also in helping to control and reduce cost of, in this case, specialty drugs. We'd also like to pose the question, though, do these prior authorization programs achieve those purposes? Well, according to one survey conducted by the AHIP back in 2019, this is conducted of a number of health plans, the answer would be yes. As you can see, a majority of the health plans said that there was a positive impact on quality of care, affordability, and safety as a result of these prior authorization programs. However, if we look at overall cost throughout the healthcare system of these prior authorization programs, it's important to take into account that while they may be financially beneficial for health plans, it may also cause a considerable burden on other parties involved, such as providers who, along with their staff, contribute a lot of time filling out the necessary paperwork, providing the specific criteria, as mentioned on the previous slide, that help get a medication approved for patient administration. It's also interesting to note that a lot of times during this prior authorization program, patients go without their medications. So this study that was conducted by the Health Science Journal argued that there is also a secondary non-adherence cost to prior authorization programs. So in their study, they actually suggest that prior authorization programs cause a higher cost than benefit. In this case, they say the benefits from prior authorization programs were $6.2 billion as opposed to the overall cost across the healthcare system being $8.1 billion. So on that note, we would suggest that yes, prior authorizations generally achieve their purposes, but in terms of payment integrity, of controlling cost, we would say there is definitely room for improvement. There's room for other approaches. So that brings us to our first poll question. We'd love to hear your opinion on this. As they relate to specialty drugs, how much value in terms of quality, financial, or both, do you find in prior authorization programs? You might say they add considerable value, they contribute equal value, but also an equal amount of burden. They cause more burden than the value that they provide, or no opinion. So we'll give you a few seconds to answer that.
Jonathan, what do you believe will be the most common answer here?
I'm going to guess it's right down the middle, that people see that they contribute value, that there's purpose in them, but they definitely are a burden on a number of people.
Yep. I'd have to agree there.
Okay. It's a few more seconds, and then we'll take a look at the results. Okay. Well, kind of as I expected, about half of the audience sees it as a kind of a split down the middle, that they definitely add value, but cause quite a bit of work as well.
Some great information there. So let's move on here. Thank you, Jonathan. And look beyond prior authorizations. So to summarize, Jonathan did a great job reviewing the current trends for specialty drug spend and also the purpose of prior authorizations. So now let's look into the payment integrity approaches for specialty drugs. We have listed here 3. First one being prepay claim review, second one being post-pay claim review, and the third one being the fraud, waste, and abuse approach. Prepay claim review enforces automated edits prior to the claim being adjudicated. Post-pay claim review is think of it more of as a safety net. This is put in place and requires less automation and more human intervention to ensure that the claims are being adjusted and paid correctly. And fraud, waste, and abuse, or better known as FWA, applies drug-specific logic that identifies suspicious claim and trends among patients, pharmacies, and or providers. Detailed actionable referrals are then delivered to health plans to act upon and prevent future aberrant behavior. So let's take a deeper dive into each one of these approaches. As a reminder here too, please remember to try to submit any of your questions in the Q&A box here within On24. Here we have a list and additional details on the common errors caught within prepaid claim approaches. Some of them being related to diagnosis codes, some being related to NDC details, route of administration, specific edits in place for drug wastage, and even maximum daily dose. Some of the benefits here, as outlined earlier, are also enforces correct coding prior to the claim being adjudicated. This really cuts down on provider abrasion since these claims are adjusted prior to that claim payment. So in this example on the right, this patient is set to receive 64 milligrams of Yervoy. This drug is being supplied in 50 milligrams or 200 milligram single-use vials. For this dose in question, the provider pooled 2 50 milligram vials and utilized 1 full vial and 1 partial vial for the dose in question. Now, as we see, we separated this out in the incorrect submission that the provider did was they submitted the correct line 1 with 64 units, indicating that the patient received 64 milligrams for this date, but they incorrectly submitted the same dose on the JW modifier line, which indicates how much drug was wasted for this dose. The prepay edit fired or signified that the dose on this line actually billed more units than the vial being used, that of a 50 milligram vial. So the correct submission would have been claim line 1, indicating the dose of 64 milligrams, and then claim line 2 being 36 milligrams, indicating how much waste was utilized for this dose. This actually resulted in savings for the health plan of $4,400 prior to the claim being adjudicated. So in summary, prepaid claim reviews pair greatly with and supports prior authorization standards and criteria. Moving on to the post-pay claim review and taking a deeper dive, some of the common errors caught here are duplication, and we have listed medical and PBM, which we'll dive into in a few slides here. Also, excessive drug units, incorrect contract rate applied, and certain drug payment policies are reviewed as well. The benefits of a post-pay claim review, it really goes deeper than automation, and it does have that human intervention. As mentioned earlier, think of it as a safety net. Sometimes certain industries and analytics companies actually do confirm the patient's dose that was administered to ensure the claim is properly adjusted after it being already originally paid. So in this example on the right, this patient, there's a prior authorization out there for a monthly administration of 700 milliliters. Now, Gaming XC is 1 HCPCS unit translates to 500 milligrams. So that always causes some concern and issues when billing these drugs. So for this instance, the provider incorrectly submitted this drug line for 700 units. As you see, they billed $25,000, and the claim capped out at charge due to the incorrect units submitted on this claim line. Now, they submitted in milliliters rather than HCPCS units, so the correct submission would be in HCPCS units, which triggers the appropriate fee schedule payment amount of $9,200. And this claim example is true, and it was found recently within the Cotiviti audit. And this actually resulted in a health plan savings of $16,385.60. So in summary, prepay is more of an automated process and edits filed prior to the claim being adjudicated. And the post-pay claim review is more of a safety net and requires additional human intervention to review the claim and make sure that it's properly adjusted. Prior to moving into the fraud, waste, and abuse examples, we wanted to provide a brief overview of how the specialty drugs are currently being dispensed and some of the trends that we're seeing. So I think we're all familiar with buy and bill process, but that is the main way specialty drugs have been dispensed in the past. So for the buy and bill, a healthcare provider purchases the drug from the distributor, stores that drug, and administers it to the patient once they have an appointment for their administration. Now, to get reimbursement for that drug, they would bill the patient's medical benefit or PBM benefit for the reimbursement. Now, in relation to these different approaches, in both the white bagging and brown bagging approach, the specialty pharmacy supplies the drug to the healthcare providers. So therefore, the healthcare provider does not or should not be reimbursed for the drug. The entity that should be reimbursed is the specialty pharmacy. Now, the specialty pharmacy can either bill the patient's PBM, pharmacy benefit manager, or the patient's medical benefit. So in the white bagging approach, the specialty pharmacy ships the drug to the healthcare provider. The healthcare provider receives the drugs and stores it and administers it to the patient once they have a scheduled appointment for the administration. Now, the healthcare provider does get reimbursed for the administration of that, but does not get reimbursed for the drug. And vice versa for the brown bagging approach, metaphorically think of it as a brown paper lunch bag. The patient either receives the drug from the specialty pharmacy, or the patient can go pick it up from the specialty pharmacy. The specialty pharmacy bills the patient's PBM or medical benefit, and the patient actually takes the drug to the healthcare provider during their appointment and is administered that dose. Now, again, the healthcare provider did not purchase the drug and should not expect reimbursement for the drug. They should only be billing for the administration of that drug for that date of service in question. Now, some of you are thinking, well, this is an interesting process, and what we're finding is that some health plans out there are actually creating policies really pushing for the white bagging approach, ensuring that specialty drugs within their market are supplying the drugs and taking care of the distribution of these drugs. Now, how does that relate into examples? We have two interesting examples here related to white bagging. So in this example, these are all billed through the medical benefit. This patient is set to receive EYLEA every 4 weeks and is scheduled to receive their next administration on April 16th, 2021. In this instance, the healthcare provider did not purchase the drug, but it was dispensed to them and shipped to them by the specialty pharmacy. The specialty pharmacy billed the patient's medical benefit on the fill date of April 7th, 2021, resulting in a paid claim. Now, on 4/16, when the administering provider administered this drug, EYLEA, they also billed the drug, creating a duplication of payment. Now, on a post-pay review, this was identified, verified with both providers on who truly did administer and supply that drug, and this actually resulted in a savings for the health plan of $1,850 due to the administering provider billing for this drug along with the specialty pharmacy. Moving on to the next example, this requires a more sophisticated data mining approach as it is a cross-platform duplicate. Same methodology of the white bagging supply of this drug, but it requires a more sophisticated data mining process due to the nature. It's spanning two different benefits, one being the pharmacy benefit and one being the medical benefit. And it's spanning two different adjudication systems. And it's also worth pointing out that typically on the PBM, it's always billed in NDC. And on the medical, it's billed mainly in HCPCS with sometimes NDCs attached on the claim form. So with that being said, this patient is set to receive Remicade on November 22nd, 2021. The specialty pharmacy supplied Remicade to the healthcare provider and filled it and shipped it on November 18th, 2021, billed the patient's pharmacy benefit, and received reimbursement for the drug. Now, the patient came in, received the administration on November 22nd, 2021, and the healthcare provider also billed for the drug and the administration here on lines 2 and 3. Now, the healthcare provider correctly billed lines 2 and 3, but actually incorrectly billed line 1. To receive proper adjudication and proper payment of this claim, the healthcare provider actually should have billed line 1 with a token charge of $1.01 or less, indicating to the health plan that they received this drug at no cost and do not expect reimbursement for the drug. This would have properly been adjudicated at $1.01 or less. They would have properly been paid for the administration, and the PBM claim was properly reimbursed, which is the top one in the amount of $7,400. So since they truly billed the true bill amount for Remicade, this actually resulted in an overpayment and a savings for the health plan in the amount of $7,231.22. So in summary, prepay and post-pay reviews are a great addition to layer on top of the prior authorizations. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to take a deeper dive into the fraud, waste, and abuse approach.
Thank you, Matt. Those examples are extremely relevant. I know we've seen a number just like those. Shifting over to a fraud, waste, and abuse perspective. It's interesting because fraud, waste, and abuse can be looked at in a prepay and post-pay perspective. Most of it is done in the post-pay world right now, but it definitely has its place in prepay as well. But fraud, waste, and abuse kind of takes a different perspective on things. And so looking at some specific pharmacy or prescription-related fraud, waste, and abuse trends that we've noticed either in the marketplace or in our own reviews, I'd like to go over a handful of examples here. First one is the billing without dispensing. This is the case where a pharmacy or a provider bills for a drug but never actually delivers the drug to the patient. This could be considered either fraud or abuse depending on the scenario. Sometimes it could be an honest mistake that ends up being fraud or waste. Or it could be a case, as we've seen in numerous news articles, that a provider or a pharmacy often will bill for expensive drugs and not ever have received the drugs, and the patients never received them either. Second example is prescribing outside scope of practice. In this case, we're looking at specific specialties where the provider is prescribing medications that don't align with their specific specialty. Next, looking at excessive use of brands when generic is available. I'd like to emphasize here, I definitely understand there are exceptions to this. There are places where there are instances where patients do require the brand name medication, or providers have had poor experiences with generics in the past and have legitimate medical reasons to lean toward brand name. However, there are also a number of cases where there's excessive use of brand names when the generic would be much more cost effective. Shifting to the bottom row, refilling a discontinued medication. This is often a simple oversight, but can result in huge dollars lost when a patient is prescribed a new medication, or even could be a new strength of the same medication, and their old prescription that still has active refills is either requested by the patient or automatically refilled by the pharmacy, leading to unnecessary fills and excessive spending where not necessary. Next, the renewal of prescription without provider approval. This would be considered a fraudulent activity where, as we all know, every prescription requires proper approval from the provider before it is renewed. And there are cases where pharmacies could renew the prescription without actually receiving that proper approval. Finally, the invalid or missing indication. This is somewhat similar to what you could find in prepay or post-pay edits as well, but the different angle here is it might be looking at medications that didn't go through prior authorization, didn't require any indication of what the diagnosis was, and could be used, it is being used for a health condition that's not approved, even off-label for that particular medication. And here on this next slide, I'll dig into some more specifics of actual examples we noticed. These were some red flags that then triggered a further investigation into what lied behind. So first of all, we noticed a prescriber on multiple occasions insisting that their patients remain on a brand name hepatitis C medication. And the total cost for those patients ended up being $431,000 for those prescriptions, whereas a new FDA-approved generic had been released months before and was covered by the plan. So this is an instance where, once again, the provider may have had a legitimate medical reason, but it would definitely warrant further investigation to see what that reasoning was and to rule out any simple just preference over brand or generic as opposed to legitimate medical necessity. The missing indication, as I mentioned earlier, this particular case was a drug that only had one approved indication. It was meant for one specific health condition, and upon looking at the patients who were receiving it and all of their diagnoses, none of them had a diagnosis for that particular health condition. And in fact, they all had a different diagnosis for a health condition that actually put them at risk of adverse effects from this medication. The third example is refilling discontinued medication. We discovered 2 different patients at the same pharmacy who were receiving refills of an older HIV medication that had been since replaced. In one case, the patient had simply switched providers, and the new provider was using a different medication, whereas the other patient was still seeing the same provider, received a prescription for a new drug that was replacing the old, yet the old prescription still got refilled. And in that particular case, it caused fills of $4,000 that were not necessary, the patients did not need. That brings us to our second poll question. Now that we've discussed 3 very important approaches to payment integrity as they relate to specialty drugs, we'd like to once again hear from you. Out of these 3 areas that we've discussed, the prepay claim reviews, post-pay claim reviews, and fraud, waste, and abuse reviews, which of these does your organization currently successfully execute, in your opinion, as it relates to specialty drugs? And on this question, please note that you can select all that apply.
Jonathan, which one of these 3 do you think will receive the least amount of votes?
Based on previous rumorings and feedback I've heard before, I think fraud, waste, and abuse might be the least addressed in terms of drugs. It's a very common area addressed by a number of companies, but pharmacy and drugs in general often fall by the wayside, it seems, when it comes to that. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at these results here. So it looks like most of you responded that post-pay and fraud, waste, and abuse actually have the most, or covered the best, whereas prepay is not hit as much.
Very interesting results here.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your responses. As we get toward the end of our presentation here, before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to take a minute to discuss, kind of step back and discuss an overall approach, some keys to implementing these payment integrity solutions or approaches. First of all, I'd like to emphasize the necessity for an allocated team and resources toward this. As we saw in the very beginning, drug spend, especially specialty drug spend, continues to go up each year, swallowing a larger portion of overall healthcare spend each year after year. And so having a team allocated specifically to addressing payment integrity within specialty drugs and within pharmacy in general is extremely important in order to help increase the savings and reduce the cost. Within that team, it's extremely important to have pharmacy expertise. Strongly urge the employment of a pharmacist especially, but also including pharmacy technicians, MDs, nurses, data scientists. I've seen that true success comes by a well-rounded team where you get different perspectives and multiple angles that you can look at to address payment integrity and find different ways of reducing cost and finding errors. And on that note, it's vital to focus on the details. As you've seen, prescription claims, medical claims for drugs, each of them have so many details, and every detail lends itself to a potential error. So it's extremely important to look at each detail of the claim and see where an error could be found. And as I mentioned before, it's important to take multiple perspectives, not just from the employees involved in creating payment integrity solutions, but also in where the error might be occurring. For instance, within fraud, waste, and abuse, we aim to look not only at providers, but also at pharmacy behavior and patient behavior, because the fraud, waste, and abuse can occur within all three angles. And finally, as I put in the middle there, we got to close the loop. There are often multiple teams working on multiple approaches, one working on prepay, one working on fraud. It's important to communicate within those groups, to break down any silos within the company, because I've seen where these teams can contribute ideas and findings to one another. It could be that a post-pay approach or review is finding a common error that could easily be caught in a prepay edit. And by communicating that forward, that kind of problem can be detected before the claim is paid, as opposed to having to chase it down after payment.
And thank you, everyone, for your time today. It was a pleasure doing this webinar. And just one thing to add, the key takeaway here is just investigate the current payment integrity approaches that you have and your company has in place, and really just ensure that there's a payment integrity approach out there related in ensuring payment accuracy as it relates to specialty drug claims.
Okay, thanks then. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you again to Jonathan, Matthew, you're both great. I'm Warren Lesniewski. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.